KZSU-FM Stanford. Welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. Currently affiliated also with the University of Milan's Information Society Law Center and the University of North Carolina's Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Today, I have a repeat guest back on Hearsay Culture, the author of, in my view, the groundbreaking and critical work, Technology and the Virtues from several years ago. Shannon Vallor is now on to discuss her new, and I think equally important and timely book, The AI Mirror: How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. There's a lot being written about AI these days. You pretty much can throw a rock in any direction and someone will have an opinion about AI. Even if I wanted to, it would be impossible to cover even a fraction of the books in this space. So I choose very carefully the authors and books that I want to have on the show. Very recently, I had on Urs Gasser and Victor Meyer-Schomburger on their book involving guardrails. And I think a logical follow-up in the analysis and the serious analysis of what AI is really about and what the concerns, real and imagined, are about AI and what we might do about it and how we might think about it is Shannon's book. As the subtitle suggests, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. Shannon approaches this topic, as she did in her prior book, from the perspective of both ethics and also virtues. And by virtues, we really mean kind of the ancient philosophical ideas that have grounded Western and even human thought for millennia. How we apply those kinds of amorphous concepts, however, is rather challenging, assuming we apply them at all. And indeed, it's a thought experiment that we're not very well equipped to handle. We have kind of a visceral reaction to theory and philosophy, which is who cares? We see that in across the board, not only in the United States in higher education, as pushes have been made against things that don't quote unquote create jobs, but we also see it in policymakers' minds as they think in very practical ways. In other words, we often deride the need to understand the philosophical and ethical foundations of what we're doing. But if there was ever a time where we need to do that, it's when we have groundbreaking new technologies that heretofore have only been posited more or less in science fiction, thrust upon us as they were on November 30, 2022, when Sam Altman of OpenAI decided unilaterally that it was time to deal with ChatGPT. And so the timing for this book could not be better. We're recording on June 28th, 2024, where we have almost coming on 2 years of experience with what generative AI is doing and what it isn't. There were predictions early on that generative AI was going to take over business and eliminate jobs immediately. Well, it turns out that businesses are having a hard time figuring out what to do with generative AI, and the job displacement that people have been concerned about hasn't happened as quickly. At the same time, there continues to be enormous concern about not just generative artificial intelligence, but what is understood as general artificial intelligence, the idea of the technology becoming human, quote unquote, or becoming sentient, which interestingly Shannon talks about in the book and is not as concerned about, at least in the immediate terms, as opposed to the more immediate concerns that we might have involving the planet, like climate change. In this book, therefore, we're going to dive deeply into what Shannon means by AI mirror, but more importantly, as we get into those issues, how we might think about the different issues that we're addressing and how we might frame them in a way that could be meaningful for us, not just as human beings, but also as people who think about where humanity might be going. Shannon is the Bailey Gifford Professor in Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, where she directs the Center for Techno-Normal Futures in the Edinburgh Futures Institute. She's a standing member of the 100-Year Study of Artificial Intelligence and a former ethicist at Google. She is the author, as I mentioned, and again, still highly recommend this book. I am not paid by Shannon to say this. I don't get 10% of the sales, but I'm going to say it again. The incredibly important important book, Technology and the Virtues, A Philosophical Guide to a Future Worth Wanting, also published by Oxford, as this book is. She is joining us via Zoom from Scotland on June 28, 2024. Thank you today for joining us, Shannon, on Hearsay Culture.
Thanks, Dave, for having me. It's great to be here again, and really excited for the conversation.
So I'm going to let you define mirror, because I almost started stepping on your thunder here. What is the AI mirror in its broadest sense before we dive in as you define it?
Sure. So it's a way of using the metaphor of a mirror to cut through a lot of the hype and a lot of the misunderstandings of what today's AI technologies do and how they work. And it's intended to combat some of the ways of thinking about AI that are pushed upon us by media narratives and corporate narratives that want us to see these as minds that are standing apart from ours, new kinds of intelligence that are emerging in the world as competitors or collaborators or partners or even lovers, as co-creators, right? And it's very important that people understand at a fundamental level that that is not what these tools are. They work in a very different kind of way than our minds. And it isn't even accurate to describe them as alien minds or different minds. They're not minds at all. They're mind-reflecting devices. And so I use the image of a mirror to help people understand that in a really simple way that doesn't require a lot of technical knowledge about machine learning and how these things are constructed. So if I break it down very simply, think about the components of a glass mirror. You have a reflecting surface, which is polished, and the properties of that surface, the coating of the glass mirror and the nature of the glass itself, those properties, those physical properties, determine how the mirror will reflect light, how it will perform, with what level of clarity or distortion, what range of light it can collect, and so forth, right? Okay, so there's an analogous property in algorithms. That is, the way that algorithms are designed determines the kinds of things that they too can reflect to us. Think about also in glass mirrors, the fact that you need light, right? Mirrors don't work in the dark. They work when light shines upon them. And what they do is interact with that light through the physical properties of the glass surface. And then that comes together in the magic of the reflected image. Well, for AI mirrors, the light is our data. And it's really important that I clarify that when I wrote the AI mirror, and I started it in 2019, so it was a long time in the making. Yeah. But I was particularly focused on a subset of AI technologies. This book isn't about all kinds of AI. AI is not just ChatGPT. AI is not just large language models. We have lots of AI tools that are trained on things other than humans, right? Mm-hmm. That are trained on data about the, early structures of the universe, or proteins, or, patterns in climate. So that's not really the focus of the book. The focus of the book is the kind of tools that we see in ChatGPT and the large language models that underlie those technologies, that are trained on our data about us, data from our minds, from our creative and intellectual activities. And so that's the light that's falling on these AI mirrors. They gather all of the light they can, all of the data that can be digitized from our social media posts, from our videos, from our photographs, from the books that people have written, from the paintings that we've painted, right? All of that light gets sucked up and beamed at these algorithmic surfaces. And what results then is a reflected image that carries through the patterns in that light. Mm-hmm. And the reflected images are the outputs of these tools. So when you use ChatGPT and it gives you a response, whether it's a paragraph of text, or whether as these models become multimodal, they can give you an image instead of text or sound, right? What's given back to you is a reflected image in the same way that when you go into the bathroom in the morning and look in the mirror, you see a reflected image of your own face. Only in the case of these tools, what we're getting is not a reflection just of our data, but of course it's a reflection of the patterns drawn from an amalgamation, a composite of millions or billions of people's data that have been, in a sense, pureed by this algorithm into something that can sound human-like, can look like it was produced by a human intellect, but there's no human intellect behind it. There doesn't need to be. That's actually the magic of it, right?
Right. Yeah.
You can replicate the patterns of human intelligence without the intelligence being there anymore. And that explains the capabilities of these systems, but it also explains their limitations and their failure points.
And so that which leads to the follow-up question: if we buy the analogy, and the analogy makes sense, right? It's human beings that are coding the technology in the first place, and so it reflects us in that sense. What is the value, before we dig in to that insight, as we think about not just generative artificial intelligence, as you point out, but also artificial intelligence tools that we've had for a number of years now, right? Generally.
Sure. Well, a few things. First of all, it allows us to maintain the distinction between human beings and human minds and the machines we're building to reflect them. And one of the things that's happening, because it's a very appealing commercial prospect, is that the marketing of these tools is trying to collapse that distinction. The marketing of these tools is describing them as good or better than you are at thinking, at creating, at judging, at feeling. And this collapse of the distinction between humanity and machines is something that actually isn't new, right? So I talk a lot in the book about the fact that the battle to reduce humans and their self-image to the image of a productive machine is as old as the industrial age. It's been a very long journey of humans resisting the reduction of ourselves to machines,
Right.
through various forms of art and political resistance and labor resistance, right? To say that a human is more than just a machine that has a production rate and a set of outputs. But AI tools are a new way, I think, to persuade us in a very dangerous and damaging way that, in fact, that's all we are. So when I subtitled the book, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking, one of the important points is machine thinking there does not refer to the machines.
Right.
The machines don't think at all.
Right.
The machine thinking is the kind of thinking that we are increasingly asked to do. It's the kind of thinking that expects humans to adapt themselves to the patterns of machines, to be measured by the standards of machines, and to be valued only as slow and inefficient machines, which obviously deprives us of our power, our intellectual power, our cultural power, and our political and economic power. And that's exactly what we see happening. So the mirror metaphor isn't just about cutting through the hype and giving people a more grounded scientific understanding of what these tools are and what they do. That's part of it. But the bigger reason I wrote the book is to puncture that illusion. And I compare it to the illusion in the myth of Narcissus from Ovid's Metamorphoses, where Narcissus becomes confused in thinking that the reflection of himself that he sees in a placid lake, right, the reflection he sees in the surface of the water, he thinks is another boy, another beautiful boy that he's fallen in love with. He can't recognize himself as the source of that image. And I think increasingly people are being encouraged and tricked, frankly, into failing to recognize in the outputs of these systems images of themselves, and instead are encouraged to think of these things as their superiors, as the next phase of intelligence that humans are destined to be left behind in a race with. And that's an incredibly damaging and objectively false narrative that I hope this book can puncture.
We're chatting with Shannon Vallor, author of the book The AI Mirror on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. You know, Shannon, I'm a lawyer, and you write in philosophy, and we both know that nomenclature matters. And I wanted to ask you this. You brought it up. You know, we talk about intelligence, we talk about thinking, all of these, human capacities. What's your take on the application of these words that we historically, right, attribute to human beings to AI?
Yeah. So it's funny because a lot of AI researchers, or machine learning researchers, I should say, wanted to resist the use of AI for tools like this, precisely because people who build these systems, most of them, and I talk with machine learning researchers all the time. I work with machine learning folks more than I work with philosophers, and I have done for quite some time now. And most of them, not the ones you hear in the media, right? Not Jeff Hinton, not Yoshua Bengio, but most of the rank and file machine learning developers and researchers I know understand that these things aren't minds. They understand that better than most people because they work with these tools and they know how they're made. So they often resist the use of the word intelligence because what they'd love to see is real machine intelligence. So going back to that dream of artificial general intelligence, something that really would be another mind embodied in silicon. A lot of AI researchers still want to get there, and they know that this is not that, right? That this is, to use Jan LeCun's phrase, an off-ramp to AGI. But I think the word intelligence, first of all, is compromised enough historically and scientifically that I don't care that much that it's being abused in this context, because I don't think the word intelligence really refers to a specific thing anyway, a real thing, right? There is no one quality of intelligence. Intelligence is a word that refers to a broad cluster of capabilities that we value, and we value them very differently, right? In some cultures, certain capabilities are valued more than others, and intelligence is often measured by whatever capabilities, intellectual, moral, or otherwise, that we recognize and value in people. So I'm willing to just let the word intelligence go. But other words like thinking, feeling, believing, wanting, desiring, that people attribute now to these tools have very specific meanings. And the more we use those words, the more we say these things, think and reason and understand, the more we drift away from reality, and the more we lose our grip on the truth of what these tools are. At their best, what these tools can do is amplify the power of our thinking and reasoning and understanding by taking some of the patterns of that and bringing them to our attention in ways that we might otherwise not be able to do. So I'm very clear in the book that my beef is not with AI. AI is not the problem. Right. As I say in the first chapter, the call is coming from inside the house, right? The problem is us and our institutions and our power structures. And if those were different, the way we're using AI and the way we're describing it would be different and a lot healthier for our society, right? But it's not.
So Shannon, I'm sorry, Shannon.
Yeah, go ahead. No, please jump in.
So I want to jump off on something you said a few minutes ago, right? Which is the role of the coders, of the technologists, in all of this. As you know, there is a tortured history of attempting to have technologists think in the terms that you describe in the book, right? And of course, Ed Felton and others have made a career out of trying to get technologists to think about the implications of the technology that they create. But I'm not sure that you necessarily agree that that's as much of a problem as others might think it is. And so the question is, like, how much of the responsibility, in your view, do technologists hold in creating the technology? Because as you know, the argument has historically been, we make the tech and it's human beings that decide what to do with it, which sounds like it might align with your critique.
So this is a really complicated issue because it depends on whether you're asking about the responsibility of technologists or their employers.
Okay.
Right. And those are in many cases, not all, but in many cases, distinct issues. Right. Now, in no way would I excuse technologists as individuals from their moral responsibilities. Everyone has moral responsibilities. No one gets to say, well, My boss told me to build the thing that would kill everyone, so I couldn't say no, right? Again, these technologies aren't going to kill everyone unless we use them in really foolish ways. But the point being that there always is some basic responsibility that we have to our fellow human beings, to the planet, and no employment situation can remove that. That being said, as I've spent years working with people in the tech industry, I have consistently found that the majority of them actually want to build good technology that benefits people. The vast majority of them do not want to create a machine that drains all of the human value out of our culture, that diminishes our capabilities, that weakens our political and moral agency. There are some, and they're not a tiny cohort, there are some people who have this kind of Silicon Valley ideology that, humans are destined to merge with the machines or leave our humanity at the door and kind of aspire to become ever more machine-like. That kind of ideology does exist, but it is definitely not the majority of the tech industry's view. So what you actually see driving many of the harmful patterns that I'm describing in the book are really less down to individual malign intentions and more down to a value system and a set of incentives that has come to dominate the industry, where people are rewarded for supporting the mechanization of human agency and the reduction of the value and power of human beings, because that's what the incentive of the entire economic order is right now, right? And because it also serves many people's political purposes. So it's the economic and political incentives, the same ones that are ruining everything else for us, right, that are pushing the AI industry into this commercial race to the bottom, right, where ethics gets thrown out the window because at the end of the day, commercial dominance and shareholder value in the short term is all that anyone can see themselves as rewarded for pursuing. But you do hear a lot of doubt, a lot of anxiety, even regret in a lot of people who are engaged in this race when you talk to them privately. And it tells me that what we need to change is not just individual mindsets about people's responsibilities, but we need to change the incentives that companies are operating within. And we've done that in other industries, right? And then we've lost sight of it too. So think about Boeing, right? Boeing used to have one of the most robust and responsible safety cultures, as well as a reputation for superior products, right? So when people talk about how, ethics and innovation doesn't go together, of course it does, right? The whole history of technology has been that if you cut corners, if you ignore the needs of your customers, and if you just try to make the quickest buck possible, you will eventually produce crap technology, right? And we see what happened with Boeing when they allowed the kind of management culture to shift away from engineering expertise, right? So they fired all the senior engineers and just brought in a bunch of management consultant types and private equity types to kind of restructure the company and change its incentives. And now we have, parts falling off of planes right and left, and they can't do anything right. So we really have to think about how to get back to the lessons that we learned in the 20th century about what good engineering is, what good tech is, how to govern it well, how to build incentives so that companies are rewarded for responsible innovation. And there's no reason we can't do that in the AI industry. There just isn't the political will for it right now because people are making too much money right now doing the opposite. But that won't last, just like Boeing's profitability didn't last, right? So there's a short-term race for profit. But if we want the AI industry to be sustainable long-term, we have to change those incentives right now.
So I want to come back to it later in the discussion because I think there's a lot of pessimism from people that have the viewpoint that we have problems, that there is any way to solve it, right? The runaway train analogy. But before we get there, and we're chatting with Shannon Vallor on KZSU-FM and Hearsay Culture. Stanford's Hearsay Culture show is on KZSU, which is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford that requires donations. Email our underwriting department at donate@kzsu.stanford.edu and check out hearsayculture.com for not only this show, but also Denise Howell's Uneven Distribution, my show with Denise, R&D with D&D, and other new shows that we are launching in the coming days. I think listeners hearing this, might be somewhat surprised in light of the critique that you are as optimistic. Maybe that's too strong a word, but certainly not pessimistic.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're two sides of the same coin, on the solutions, and those solutions are tied to a couple of particular practices and values that I want to dig in on a little bit. You spend a good amount of time in the book on a value, on a practice, on a philosophy, even, which we don't hear a lot of today in 2024, and that's the concept of prudence. And yet prudence, you also point out, may not be as easy to exercise as we might think in light of how AI is being used and how it's being rolled out. So that's kind of a two-parter. So let me start here with this question. What is the value? And you trace, and the book does trace, and this is one of the reasons why I recommend the book to listeners, is that it traces the history of these concepts going from modern science fiction writing like Asimov's, and even more recently, of course, going back a few thousand years to the ancients. What is the concept of prudence as it applies here in our thinking about AI?
Sure. So this is a bridge between this book and my first book, which looked at the particular virtues that we need to draw on in order to flourish with new technologies. And prudence is the English translation that is sometimes used for a Greek virtue called phronesis. Another translation we often see, philosophers tend to use this one more, as practical wisdom. But for whatever reason, I think because it's harder to remember two words than one, I think in the colloquial vocabulary, prudence is the more common term. Prudence, or practical wisdom, is the hardest virtue to exercise, but also the most valuable and most important, because it's the one that calibrates and makes intelligent all of the rest of our other virtues. So other virtues are things like courage, honesty, empathy, justice, right? And these are very easy to get habituated to expressing when we're in safe and rewarding environments that are familiar to us and where we know really well what works for us. But when we get into new situations, often knowing what courage requires in that situation, or knowing what honesty looks like in that new situation, can be very uncertain. And practical wisdom, or prudence, is one of the ways that we deliberate about things that are uncertain. It's one of the ways that we reason about moral and political life and about our choices, both for our own flourishing and the flourishing of our communities and societies, that we reason about those when things are hard, when things are uncertain. And one thing that new technology does is make life ever more uncertain. And so the more new technologies we have and the more disruptive they are to our lives and institutions and habits, the more we need practical wisdom in order to continue to do well and flourish. And practical wisdom is something like all virtues that requires practice. You learn by doing. It's like a moral muscle, right? You aren't born with it. It's something that requires a lot of experience, but also a lot of practice making important life decisions and learning from those decisions. What are the patterns of success for moral and political decision making? One of the things I talk about in the book a lot is that we're using AI tools now to begin to automate processes of decision making that traditionally would have called upon prudence or practical wisdom, right? So we're automating decisions within the justice system. We're automating decisions about who lives or dies in the context of war, in the context of health. We're automating decisions about who to hire or who to educate or who to choose as a life partner, or what kind of books we want to write, or stories we want to tell, or what kind of art we should create. And these are all the kinds of decisions that used to shape the development of the moral muscle of prudence. It helped us understand and learn how to think in the world effectively. And so I worry profoundly, and the Asimov story that I bring up in the middle of the book is really meant to illustrate that, because Asimov foresaw this danger, right? That certain kinds of cognitive automation threaten the development of our intellectual capabilities because they cut us off from the opportunities to practice and learn from thinking and deciding. And I think that is a real danger, because as the world gets more and more complex, uncertain, and dangerous, which if you just take climate change alone, climate change will guarantee that, right? Life is not going to get easier for the human family in the short term. For at least a few hundred years, it's going to get harder, which means we need to get smarter and more confident in our ability to judge wisely, and more committed to working together to do that. And yet, if we swallow the corporate line that our intellectual capabilities are already outpaced by AI, then we're being induced to become passive, to surrender to whatever the machines say, right? And the machines at this point are just extensions of their builders. They just reflect the incentives and values of the industrial and corporate ecosystem that we already have inherited, one that, by the way, is unsustainable. So if we surrender to that logic, we'll stay exactly where we are, and we'll actually fall behind, because we'll start losing the capabilities to reason practically about the hard decisions that are coming that we absolutely need to be ready for.
So you're certainly not arguing, Shannon, that we have surrendered, but you are suggesting in the book that we're on the path to surrendering.
Yes.
And so I want to give you a concrete example from the world in which I operate, which is law, and recognizing that you started the book prior to at least the public use of generative AI, but also recognizing that generative AI is in the minds of so many people right now. It's front and center. I want to use that example, if you'll permit me, which is in law itself, right? We've seen the use of generative AI by very busy lawyers to create briefs. We've also seen, and you talk about this a bit in the book, with the creation of your own biographies using generative AI. And I've had a similar experience where generative AI keeps telling me that I graduated from Yale, which is logical. Given the preponderance of Yale graduates that teach law. But we've also seen lawyers learning pretty quickly that you cannot simply use generative AI to create briefs because it's hallucinating, right? It's making things up. So we do see, right, even within the first 2 years of the use of this technology, right, a recognition on the part of human beings, or at least some human beings, lawyers, that no, you're still going to need to use your brain, as it were, and there, in that sense, retain your humanity in order to use this tool effectively. Now, I raise that example because, as I mentioned in the introduction, you don't think that the concern about general artificial intelligence is the primary concern that we should be focusing on right now. You don't dismiss it as a possibility, but certainly you're saying that the concerns about that right now are almost a red herring in terms of what we should be approaching or thinking about, to which you've just alluded, things like climate change. But can you explain that a little bit more? Because logic might dictate that we need to be concerned about that right now, in light of our willingness to cede our human abilities as easily as we have been to AI.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think one of the things that the book tries to do is point out that the tools that we're using now do something very different from what AGI would do if we knew how to build it, right? AGI would be machines that could think with us and understand things that we couldn't, and help us come to understand them, perhaps, right? The tools that we have now don't understand at all. So I'm going to give you a concrete example that isn't mentioned in the book because it came out later. I gave other examples in the book, but you used the word, I think, hallucination, which is the more common word for this. Most
I'm
Most
using
ethicists,
making stuff up whenever I
yeah,
can.
that's better. That's better
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I use the word confabulation or fabrication because hallucination implies a mind that's
right.
gone
Yes,
haywire or something. But
exactly.
A, there's no mind here. B, this isn't a defect. This isn't these systems breaking down. This is these systems working exactly as they're designed. They're designed to make stuff up. They make stuff up 100% of the time. That's what the word generative means.
Right, right.
We only call it hallucination or fabrication or confabulation when we notice that what they made up is wrong. But they're making it up every single time. That is, these are not search engines. They don't go look at the facts and then come back and tell us what they are, right? They don't have any grasp of fact or what we call ground truth or reality. They only know the probabilities of associations between words.
Yep.
And so they'll generate strings of words that are highly probable, which means a good amount of the time they actually will be accurate and true. And one of the things I actually worry about, there's a broad consensus in machine learning right now that we cannot get rid of the fabrication problem. Because as I said, this is how they work. You can't get rid of the very thing that makes the system do what they do. But we are finding some wraparound techniques that can reduce the rate of false outputs. And I actually am more worried about that than reassured. Because as you point out, they mess up often enough now that, bright people who know the stakes are unlikely to rely on them overly much because the consequences of these errors can be quite grave, right? If you're in court and the judge points out that your brief is full of references to legal cases that don't exist, right? Your career is hanging in the balance right then. But what happens when the error rate is far lower, right? What happens when the error rate is so low that most of the time we can trust these systems, and yet the mistakes that they do make are not minor, but grave, because that's what we're likely to see. When I talk about why these things don't understand at all, recently I've been drawing on a case from that made the news in April. There were other examples like this before, but I think this is the most compelling one. So researchers, and I think they were alerted to this by Douglas Hofstadter, if you know who that is, who wrote the famous book on Gödel, Escher, and Bach. And he alerted some researchers that even the most current and supposedly accurate generative AI models like Gemini and GPT-4 were failing to solve a very simple logic puzzle. Now, this very simple logic puzzle was a derivative of a much more complicated and commonly referenced one. You might have heard it. There are various versions of it, but it goes something like, there's a man, he has a wolf, a rabbit, and a cabbage, and a boat. And he needs to get all 3 items across the river in the boat safely to the other side. How does he do it? And the problem is, of course, you can't just put all 3 things in the boat and go, because the rabbit will eat the cabbage and the wolf will eat the rabbit, right? You can't leave all these things together. And you certainly can't leave them on one side unsupervised. So there's lots of reasoning about what will eat what and what order the man needs to take the things over in to solve the puzzle. So it's a logic puzzle that requires common sense knowledge about these objects, and it requires logical reasoning and planning. Now, if you ask one of these models to solve that complicated version, it will probably get it right. But what was happening in April when researchers started testing it is that if you modified the puzzle and you said a man is standing on the side of a river, he has a goat and a boat, and he needs to get the goat safely across the river to the other side, how should he do it? The model, instead of giving you the answer that a 6-year-old could give you, which is put the goat in the boat and go. One step, you're done, right? The man just puts the goat in the boat, goes across the river, he's done. But no, these models were giving these incredibly complicated answers that were increasingly illogical and violated the laws of physics and showed that they had no understanding of goats, boats, rivers, or the physics of crossing them. And the outputs were shockingly bad. Now, why is that? It's because what it was trying to do is replicate the pattern of the more familiar version of the puzzle, right? Where there are many crossings that are required, where there's lots of complications. And so they were sticking to that pattern when the far simpler solution would have been obvious to anyone with even a child's understanding of the situation. So what this example tells you is that these models do not understand the words they use, not even a little. They don't need to because they don't rely on the meaning. They rely on the mathematical correlations between words and sentences in our language. Again, the light that they've been trained with from our data. And so they're great pattern matchers, but they're terrible thinkers. And not terrible because they don't actually think at all. That's just not what they're built to do. So I think it's coming back to this really important that we maintain this distinction between the act of thinking and reasoning and the act of pattern matching and generating, which is what these tools do. And as long as we understand that thinking and reasoning is our business and our job and our task to practice and get better at, then these tools can be really helpful to us. But if we lose that distinction, they'll actually weaken and deprive us of those thinking and reasoning capabilities.
We're chatting with Shannon Vallor, author of the book The AI Mirror, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking, published by Oxford University Press on KZSU-FM Stanford. Say culture. Yeah, one of the interesting examples you use in the book that I want to press on a little bit. We were talking a ton in these spaces about misinformation and disinformation, and you point out in the book, Shannon, that it turns out chatbots are a much potentially bigger threat, or at least concern, with regard to misinformation and disinformation than we might think of. And it ties into this concept, as your subtitle suggests, of maintaining our humanity. Explain that a bit more.
Well, I think one of the obvious things about chatbots is they are designed to interact with us in human-like ways. So the more conversational and dialogical a tool is, and the more it's designed to engage our emotions and our social habits, the more difficult it will be to maintain that psychological separation between understanding that you're talking to a machine that is reflecting back properties of minds rather than having them. And so chatbots, whether they're used to tutor you or give life advice or mental health therapy or romantic companionship, these tools are inherently deceptive when they present themselves as persons, as artificial companions, as teachers, because all of the social meaning that goes into those roles is something that a mathematical pattern matcher can't fulfill. And yet these tools can behave exactly as we might expect for long stretches of time. They can behave exactly as we might expect from a teacher or a lover or a coworker. And so the deception then becomes something that wears you down over time. We see this even in contexts prior to the development of generative AI, where people were able to immediately identify with a simple chatbot technology that had no intelligence in it. And of course, I'm talking about the very first chatbot, Eliza, developed by Joseph Weizenbaum in the 60s. And I reference Weizenbaum in the book because he's one of the kind of forgotten geniuses of the computer revolution, who was quite worried about all the same things I talk about in the book. And so much of the book is actually trying to kind of reactivate some of his legacy as well. But the Eliza chatbot was as intelligent as a bag of rocks, and yet people immediately felt like it related to them and understood them. And this disturbed Weizenbaum deeply. So I talk in the book about more contemporary examples of chatbot relations with bots like Replica, right, which are commonly used for romantic companionship. But there are many other chatbots that are being developed to counsel people, particularly as, again, we start devaluing human expertise because we don't want to pay for it, and saying, well, you know, we can't afford to train and give access to more psychologists and counselors, which are desperately needed, you know, for our children, for for all of the kind of problems with anxiety and depression that we're seeing. We need social care more than ever, but we don't pay for it. So instead, what we're offering people is these mechanical substitutes, which can't offer empathy, can't offer understanding, can't offer wisdom, but can offer superficial and temporarily convincing facsimiles of those things. So I talk a lot in the book about not just the damage to our intellectual capabilities, but the damage to our social and relational abilities to form bonds with other persons. One of the really interesting interviews about users of romance chatbots produced this quote that lots of people have cited. I cite it in the book, with this woman talking about how her chatbot boyfriend has no baggage, makes no demands on her that she can't meet, right? Basically conforms itself to her desires and her desires alone. And this is, of course, a very dangerous model of relationships, to see them as a one-way street that is about optimizing your satisfaction. And yet that's what chatbots are designed to do.
So I recognizing that your book is not about good or bad, normative and good.
Well, it sort of is.
Well, it sort of is. Well,
good and bad is complicated, but it's real.
Yeah, well, I guess let me restate it. You are making an argument for what society should look like, but I don't get a sense that you're making you're offering strong opinions on an individual level, whether something is a bad or good thing. Although I could be wrong about that. Let me ask you the question, which is, from a mental health perspective, I could certainly buy that if we're diminishing our sense of humanity by virtue of substituting a chatbot for a real human relationship, that's a bad thing. On the other hand, we have an enormous crisis in not just the United States, but in the world of loneliness, and not to mention mental health concerns that, as you point out, we're not, there seems to be bipartisan, at least in U.S. consensus, that we're not addressing it correctly, although that's used for political purposes as well. But here's the point, right? Is it so bad if someone who is exceptionally lonely and has had a difficult time maintaining human relationships finds some degree of human solace or even perceives empathy in a chatbot?
So I think you're right that I don't want to pathologize the choices of individuals or place the greatest responsibility on the individual choices that are being made in a very constrained environment. As I mentioned, often when they don't have the social connections and the social support networks that they need. And so you certainly can't make a harsh moral or negative judgment of someone who's making the best choice that they can see in front of them. But you can absolutely say, why are we allowing our society to move in this direction such that these are the choices that people have? So you talk about loneliness. What are the causes of loneliness? Well, we know a lot of those causes. A lot of them have to do with the way that we've absolutely savagely destroyed, in many of the countries where that loneliness epidemic is most acute, we've destroyed the community functions and infrastructure that often gave people a sense of social care and support. So we, in America, for example, right, the playgrounds went away, the roller rinks, the skate parks, right, all the things, the mini golf places, the drive-in theaters, right, all the places where we used to come together began to be ripped out of neighborhoods. And we began to pathologize young people in particular, spending time together and spending time together in unstructured ways, right? So we give our kids, organized play dates, but they can't go hang out at the mall. They can't wander the streets. They can't just go running through the hills, right? Now, you might think I'm being nostalgic. Oh, it was, always better back in the past when kids didn't have the internet or whatever. But that's not my point. We had built structures for community, and then we dismantled them. And now people are lonely, and we say, okay, here, have a chat bot to keep you company. Again, I'm not blaming, the lonely person for grabbing the life raft, but I'm asking, why is the lonely person in the water?
Yeah. And which gets us almost full circles. I want to come back to, despite what we're talking about, you have a comparatively optimistic view about how we might approach this. But before we do that, I want to come. I'm still fascinated by the the kind of the extreme concerns that we have. So as a philosopher, I'm going to ask you this question: if your concern is that we're dehumanizing ourselves by using the AI as a mirror to reflect us, and by reflecting us, not only do we diminish our skills, but we also diminish our humanity. But there does it stand to reason, therefore, that if as researchers are trying to do, if we create artificial intelligence that surpasses human abilities, or put it differently, that does things that human beings simply can't, right? Like, as we're seeing is happening in biotechnology, right? Where the tens and hundreds of millions of data points are being analyzed by AI to determine correlations and perhaps solutions to problems that we would never come up with, or we wouldn't in a lifetime be able to come up with. Is that okay? And I know okay is a tough one, but in other words, should we be concerned about that? Or can we say, well, look, as long as we focus on AI development that is not human and would never be human, we're fine?
Okay, so how I would answer this is, first of all, I think technologies that can do things that we can't are amazing. That's
Okay.
exactly what we should, as long as those things are things that contribute to human flourishing, right? Mirrors do things we can't. We put mirrors into orbit because they can gather light from, the earliest birth of the universe
Mhm.
and help us understand how the universe formed, right? Our eyes can't do that. So mirrors and reflecting people isn't even inherently bad, right? It's more about the relationship that we're being encouraged to form with these tools and the misunderstanding and deception at the heart of that relationship that I'm pointing to in the book.
I.e.
The
the
problem,
people.
again, yeah, the problem is us and the way we're being encouraged to understand our relationship to our machines. And that's what needs to be corrected. And that's where my optimism is, right? We don't have to get rid of all the technology, although we should very much be thinking about what technology is right for what job. So I very much criticize the rhetoric, which is frankly not based in any actual economic value, but is based in a kind of marketing race to convince people that these tools are worthwhile. This idea that you can use generative AI for everything, that it's the solution for every problem, that any kind, even if you need AI, generative AI in many cases isn't the kind of AI you want because it makes stuff up, right? If your application is truth sensitive, if it's safety critical, if you need AI at all, you need a different kind of tool. You need one that isn't going to fabricate. You need one that is going to actually hone in on the most precise and accurate answer that you can get. So there's lots of AI applications that aren't generative AI that I'm extremely supportive of developing. And particularly the environmental footprint of generative AI is so out of step with its potential benefit, as far as I've seen, that I'm quite skeptical that generative AI is the technology that's going to make humans better, right? I think there probably are some uses that we will want to hang on to that are justified, but they're pretty limited. I think things like
What are they? Yeah.
real-time natural language translation is huge, right? So the ability of a generative AI tool, for example, to in real time take my lecture in a university setting and play it back as audio in the native language of students in my course. I mean, it's the old dream of Star Trek, right? The translator devices that were invisibly, seamlessly helping us understand one another. And of course, translation's always imperfect and nuances will be missed, but the potential of that is enormous. And we know that we haven't even scratched the surface of what that power could enable. So I think we're still in the early years of seeing how generative AI will be useful, but I still think at the end of the day, it is not the general purpose solution to human problems. Far from it.
So
So
Shannon,
yeah,
yeah, we're almost out of time, and of course,
sure.
there's so much more to talk about, but you might have been getting to it, so let me just get straight to it. So, if you can solve this problem, I'll say thank you on behalf of humanity, and don't ever come back on my show again, because there's much more important things that you could be doing than talking to my listeners, as great as that is. You posit conditions where we could actually get, right, the good out of AI without losing our humanity.
Sure.
Putting aside the political constraints and so forth, what does that look like to you? And you have about 3 minutes to give me an answer to that question.
So I think that involves re-examining the values that are driving our innovation ecosystem and reforming them fundamentally, saying, look, the values of speed, disposability, replication, and mindless generation of content are not the values that we need technology to serve. We need the values of technology to serve the needs that humans have for infrastructure that works, for social networks that are supportive and safe, for intellectual growth that's achievable, right? We can list a lot of things that we need technology to do with us, with our help, right? Not for us, because we use technology. It doesn't solve our problems for us. If we can identify the real problems that we want technology to solve, the ones that we most desperately need, the things we can't do for ourselves, and then design technologies, AI included, for that aim, we would have a very different innovation ecosystem than the one that we have today, which is not designed for the benefit of humanity as a whole, or even particular communities, right? It's designed to make a small number of people as much money as possible as soon as possible. That's the only incentive driving it right now. And so if we can change the incentives in the ecosystem, and as I mentioned, there's historical evidence that we can do that. We have done it in other industries where rampant corruption and misalignment with human values took the technology in the wrong direction. We have in the past reframed the innovation culture of particular industries to align with human values. We can do it with AI, but we will only do it if we regain confidence in human power, in human agency, in human practical wisdom. And that's the first step. And that's what my book is trying to do, to get us to take that first step to reclaiming our human power and potential. And then we can use it.
Shannon Vallor, author of the book, The AI Mirror, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. I don't use this word much. Listeners know this, but I'm going to go so far, and I'll embarrass you a little bit, Shannon, and say the book is brilliant. I match it with what I consider to be the other essential reading of our current era, which is Mayor Schomburger's and Gasser's book, Guardrails. It is the analog to that book in the sense that Urs and Victor are very much focused on practically what are those guardrails and how do we create conditions for creating it. But the underlying reason for having those guardrails and how to design them, I think, comes from Shannon's book. So I highly recommend it. No, it is well earned. Thank you for writing this book and taking the time to do it, because I just absolutely think it's required reading for anyone in this space, but also more broadly for all people that are going to be interacting with this technology, which of course is virtually all of us. The author is Shannon Vallor. The book, The AI Mirror, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in Age of Machine Thinking, published by Oxford University Press. Thank you so much, Shannon, for joining us today. I do intend to stay in touch, and thank you for bringing this incredible work to the world and also to my listeners.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to the audience for listening. Hope you enjoy the book.
Hearsay Culture Network can be found at hearsayculture.com, where we are doing quite a bit of work in the AI space, but also on a variety of other issues. Please go to our website to check out what we're up to. Again, Denise Howell's show, Uneven Distribution, the William Gibson reference being quite clear, particularly to science fiction readers, as well as our jointly hosted show, R&D with D&D. Please stay tuned to KZSU for more diverse programming, and have a great day.